Okay, seems to have quieted down a little bit. Are we ready to get started? Okay. First, before we actually get started in earnest, I want to let everybody know that we will be recording. We are recording the session today. So if you have any difficulties with that, this would be the time to jump off, but we are recording it and it will be posted on both of the BayREN site as well as the localenergycodes.com site for your pleasure. Thank you all. Good morning and welcome to the second session of the Reach Codes Newcomers Webinar Series. The series is a collaborative effort between BayREN, the SEEK group, and the statewide Reach Codes program. My name is Misty Bruceri, and I'm the coordinator for the Reach Codes program, for the Utilities Reach Codes program. And I'm here with our co-sponsors and co-hosts, Karen Christensen from BayREN and Angie Hacker from SEEK. Good morning to you all. Thanks for making the time. Today's session, we're going to focus on the Reach Code adoption process. Okay, so let's take a look at the agenda here. Okay, so first I'm going to start with a few logistics for the meeting, and then I'll do a quick review of the highlights from session 1. Following that, I'll turn it over to Karen to dive into the details of the adoption process. She's going to highlight some important milestones and tips for you, as well as including a special focus on engaging stakeholders and some equity considerations. Following Karen's presentation, we'll hear directly from Damian Hardman, Corey Downs, and Barry Hooper. 3 representatives. Yes.
You're not sharing your screen, I think you.
Oh, I apologize. Thank you very much. How's that? Thank you. And my apologies. Okay, so we have Damian Hardman, Corey Downs, and Barry Hooper. They are 3 representatives from 3 different local jurisdictions that have kindly volunteered to share their experiences with Reach Code adoptions with you today. Once they do that, we'll be following that with a Q&A session where you will have a chance to talk with each one of them and ask some questions. I think this is a really great panel today. Each of these jurisdictions, actually, not only do they have a different ordinance structure, the jurisdictions themselves are very, very different and have different processes too. So should cover quite a wide range for you. Okay, so let's just go ahead and go into some logistics. As I noted earlier, we are recording the session today, and that recording will be available online, both on the BayREN site as well as the localenergycodes.com website. We're going to pause during the natural breaks for questions in the presentation, and we ask that you raise your hand during the presentation to ask for clarifications or things like that. We will answer short questions if we can stop in the flow. But otherwise, we will stop periodically to answer questions. And if you have something that is just more of a comment or maybe a more complex question, if you could put that in the chat, we'd really appreciate that. And then we'll get to it when we pause. Okay. So just a quick reminder about the purpose of this webinar series. Our objective here is to provide background and technical information for local government staff that are new to the Reach Codes process to give you the tools you need to get through the process. We are not encouraging any particular type of a Reach Code. We're not discussing how to advocate for a particular Reach Code or even for any Reach Code. We're not going to get into any technical calculations or details today. And we're also not going to talk about compliance with the Reach Code at this point. We do have a session that will be focused on implementation, and that is later this year in September. And so we will talk about those kinds of things then when we get a little bit closer. Okay. Before we start, though, we'd like to do a quick little poll, if that's okay with everybody. I will drop that in the chat. I'd like to just find out who's in the room with us. Who are we talking to today? Grab that. And if you would be so kind as to click on that link and answer there's 2 questions there, I'd really appreciate that. And I'm going to go ahead and switch tabs. Can you see the second tab, Karen, or do I need to switch that? Can you see the poll?
I can see it. If you want, I can share my screen with it in just a second. We've got about 30 responses.
Okay.
I think you have it's a different link. I'll just share it.
I think it'll be better for you to do that one. Okay. Sorry.
I see a couple more coming in, so we'll just hold on just a moment here.
Okie doke. We will share that momentarily.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, if you can see that, there we go.
Looks like we had most folks on the call responding. We have 47 responses here, and definitely a majority are local government representatives, as well as some regional and state government. What's our biggest one? We have some consultants as well, and other. We have a couple of utility reps as well as other. It looks like our biggest groups are the local government, utility, and consultants. Okay, thank you very much. And it looks like we've got about half the folks from the Bay Area and a pretty good split around the rest of the state here, with 20% or so in Southern California. And then what do we have? About another 12% in the Central Coast, and a few others scattered around. So pretty good mix across the state. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for doing that poll. We really appreciate it. Go back to the presentation here, and we can go ahead and get on with the topic. Alrighty. Okay, I'm going to do just a quick review from session 1. Session 1, we talked about REACH code basics. What is a REACH code? Why would you want to adopt one? What's the legal authority? What are some considerations? So I'm going to just touch on the highlights from that session very quickly. REACH code is an amendment to the building code. California State grants the authority to local governments to make amendments to the building code, provided those amendments meet certain requirements. As the amendment's tied to the building code, it has to be readopted with each new code cycle, which is every 3 years. So you have to make sure that the amendment is tied to the current code. Any amendment has to be more restrictive than the state code. It can't be less. You can't make an amendment that allows people to get out of a requirement. Okay. It has to be more restrictive. And the local government also has to make findings that the REACH code is actually necessary, that there's a local need for that REACH code, either based on climatic, geological, topographical, or environmental reasons. And lastly, you must file that ordinance with the California Building Standards Commission before it's legally enforceable. Okay. Now, there are other policy tools that are available, such as amending a health and safety code and using police powers or other things, but we are not focused on those tools today. We will be talking about those in April. We have our 4th session will be on the different structures of ordinances, and so we will include those at that time. But today we're going to be focusing specifically on energy REACH codes. Okay. Energy REACH codes are a particular kind of REACH codes that amend just the energy code. They amend Part 6 of the building code. So just that one part. Because they're a building code amendment, they're subject to all the requirements we just went over. but they also have a few additional requirements they have to meet. First, any energy reach code must result in a reduction in energy use. The official word used is diminution, but basically you have to make sure that the code results in buildings using less energy than the state would allow. Also has to be cost effective. There's a lot of discussion around cost effectiveness that could be going on here, and we will be covering that in session 3. We're going to get into details there about cost effectiveness, why you care, what you need to know, some of the terms, things like that. So I highly recommend you attend that session next month. Also, an energy reach code is not allowed to preempt the federal appliance standards. So the federal government regulates most appliances, and they do not allow either state or local governments to preempt those regulations. So a state or local government cannot make another requirement. For example, you could not specifically mandate high efficiency HVAC equipment, for example. If the federal government regulates it, then states and local governments are not allowed to preempt that regulation. And lastly, an energy reach code has to go through the CEC approval process before you file with the BSC. Something to keep in mind about that process is that the CEC, they have an internal process that includes getting on their business meeting schedule and some internal review and comments. And so that can take a little bit of time, 2 to 3 months at the CEC. So please do make sure to include that timing in your planning. Typically, the overall process can take somewhere between 6 to 12 months. It can be longer, it can be a little bit shorter, it depends, but that's about an average range that we see. Okay. Alrighty. I am going to, having covered the highlights from last session, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Karen to get into the details of the process.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to try to move relatively quickly through this because I really want to have time for our local government folks. I think that's going to be really valuable to hear. But I want to make sure to cover a number of points first and set the stage for them. So I'm Karen Christensen. I lead the Bay Area Codes and Standards program out of the Association of Bay Area Governments. And today I'm going to be focusing on reach code process and timing. So I'm going to start with the timing. As we talked about last time, a reach code reaches above and is based on a state energy code. So the timing is connected to the state code timing. Right now we are here in 2020, can I do this? There we go. In 2022, the 2019 code is in effect through the end of the calendar year. The 2022 code has been adopted and all of the supporting documentation and software is being developed as we speak. And that will take effect January 1st, 2023, be in effect for 3 years, and then we'll move on to the 2025 code. So what that means in terms of local energy reach codes is you can really adopt one anytime from when the code materials are firm enough to, so that you know what is in the 2022 code and you can calculate cost effectiveness through the end of the code cycle. And then the reach code is in effect during that 3-year period from the time that it's adopted through the end of it. So there are certain advantages to adopting at a couple of key points, even though it can be adopted at any time. And oops, that was not what I meant to, button I meant to hit. There we go. Get back to here. Whoops. Goodness gracious. All right. So ahead to, so the choices. Here we go. So there really are sort of 3 choices. One that I've called single start, which is where the reach code takes effect and starts at the same time that the state code starts. And in order to have that single start date, the reach code needs to be adopted September, October, maybe at the latest, in order to allow time for that process of going through the California Energy Commission, Building Standards Commission, getting everything lined up to start January 1st, 2023 at the beginning of the code cycle. And the advantage of that is that there's just one date where the building code changes, like December 31st, you got one code, January 1st, you've got another, and the REACH code's already in place, it's all set. Otherwise, there can be two changes. So single adoption, talk about that for a moment. With that one, every jurisdiction is supposed to adopt the updated building code and often makes amendments to the building code. Things that don't have anything to do with energy could be related to fire sprinklers, fire hardening, could be related to all sorts of things. And that's usually done in November, sometimes December, towards the end of the year. So taking a REACH code, then you can have one city council meeting or board of supervisors meeting where all of the amendments to the building codes are being considered at the same time. But because there's that time where the Energy Commission needs to review it, you need to go through the Building Standards Commission, there would be a lag before it would take effect. So you'd have the new state code taking effect January 1st, and in all likelihood, the REACH code would take effect a little bit later. And this can be a problem, especially if you've got an existing REACH code that you want to continue, then you don't really want this lag here. But it's also to remember, important to remember that you can adopt your REACH code anytime, and it will be in effect at any time. So many advantages, or there are advantages to each of those. And this table just sort of summarizes everything that I just said, so I'm not going to go through it, but it will be there in the slides when you get them for reference. This is a little more detailed look with some timing of the different steps and how they overlap with each other. And the key point here is, well, just a couple things. One is that it won't look exactly like this for any particular jurisdiction, won't be the same for any two jurisdictions, depending on the stakeholder process, what committees are involved, and how that works at the local level. But it gives you an idea of the flow and helps you get a sense of what you need to do when in order to aim for a particular implementation date. This is also available on the BayREN website, and I think we have a version, Excel version you can download and play with if you want to make it your own. So I'm going to go back to the more generalized process and just talk through some of the key points for each of these steps. And I'm going to start from the end and move to the beginning because, frankly, I think some of the end ones are a little less complicated, but there's important things that you want to keep in mind even at the beginning. So helpful to see where you're headed. So start with implementation. As Misty said, we're not going to talk very much about compliance or implementation until we get to session 5, when we're going to focus on this. But just important to keep in mind from the start that once you've developing and adopting your REACH code is a huge undertaking. It can take a lot of time and effort, but once you've adopted it, you haven't actually achieved any of the goals of the REACH code itself to save energy or reduce greenhouse gases. That doesn't happen until it's implemented. So the implementation is really important, and in a way, the adoption is just the start of that process. It's not always as simple as you might think. There can be time and staff constraints, lack of information. So having someone who can really champion that and keep an eye on it while going through, provide information and support, and track the results, like, is it happening the way it's supposed to, can be really helpful. So as I said, we'll get to that and more on that in September when people are more ready for it, but just want to put it on people's radar screens. And then, but before we get to implementation, there's the state agency review and approval. One is to the California Energy Commission. All local governments need to submit REACH codes to the Energy Commission. And this slide lists the materials that are needed, include the adopted REACH code, the findings and analyses, including information about cost effectiveness, and a finding that the local energy standards will require the buildings to consume no more energy than permitted by Part 6. That's what Misty was talking about, the you can't have a REACH code that's less restrictive than the state code. And then relevant CEQA documents, usually a neg deck, but it can vary. And the Energy Commission will have a comment period and will act on the REACH code at a business meeting. The local governments also need to send the REACH codes to the Building Standards Commission. Their materials are similar, a little different. A cover letter, an adopted ordinance, some findings, including the finding that the amendment is necessary because of local climatic, geological, or topographical conditions, and the justification for that. And that can all be in the ordinance or the staff report. The BSC doesn't act on REACH codes the way the CEC does, but they will just let you know if there's a problem. Like if you don't tell them if this finding isn't made, you'll get a letter from the BSC saying, hey, we didn't get that finding. Can you give it to us? So you do have to file it with them and they will review it. So what that means is you need to just think ahead. The required findings are that the REACH code is cost effective, that it will not allow buildings to use more energy than the California energy standards, and it's necessary because of local climatic, geological, or topographical conditions. These conditions, they don't need to be unique to your jurisdiction, just because of whatever reason, depending on your REACH code, you might come up with. So these findings need to be formally acted on by your council or board. Usually they're incorporated into the ordinance, and they do need to be supported by material in the staff report and in the record. They sound complicated, but don't reinvent the wheel. Take a look at materials from other jurisdictions. These are available easily online at the CEC and localenergycodes.com website. So take a look at what other jurisdictions, like, how did they make those findings? How did they support them? There's no, there are no prizes given for originality. So, help each other out and use what you can find. You can also consult with the Energy Commission staff. Danuta Drozdovich, who gave the introduction last time, is great and will help you, through the process. So talk with her early and get her input on that. And reach out for other help. The Barron County reps, the localenergycodes.com. There's plenty of people who can help you. And also within your city, if you can talk to your city or county attorney, your building official, and other staff as well, they might be able to help you out. So this is not, it's not as difficult as it might sound at first glance. And there are also plenty of resources about this. So the Energy Commission has information about how to submit to them and what they need. The Building Standards Commission has the same, and there's some information and templates also available. Okay, so the formal public process and adoption. So this is the formal action when the City Council or Board of Supervisors actually adopts a REACH code. So requirements usually include 2 hearings before the City Council or Board of Supervisors. Usually one is on the consent calendar and one is a full public hearing where everybody can get up and speak and there's discussion and debate. Although it could be 2 hearings with that. It depends, and it also can vary from city to city, whether it's the first one or the second one that has the discussion and the debate, or which one's on the consent calendar. So check with your city, county clerk, and your attorney for just what the situation is and what's needed. Usually you'll need a staff report. There's usually a presentation, public noticing. City clerk or county clerk will be the key person on that, but just to be aware of. And when you get to the public hearings, you will have done a lot of work, all of the stuff that's out of sight, but that is preparation and setting the base for the formal action. So then you roll it all up into the staff report and the presentation, the part that people see. And when you get there, just consider the issues. What issues are the council members likely to raise? What issues could the public raise? Who's likely to come? What questions do you think might come up, and are you prepared to answer them? Double check you have all those findings in there and all the requirements are being met. And again, take a look at the staff reports and presentations from other jurisdictions. And what you're aiming for is a clear report that sets forth the key issues and considerations, meets all of the legal requirements, and originality is not necessary. So use the help you can get. All right, any questions so far? Anything in particular? I'm trying to move quickly, but I think it's pretty straightforward. I can't even see if there are questions.
We don't have any questions in the chat yet.
No questions. All right. Okay, well, I will move along then. That's great. So to the first part of the process, the REACH code development, these 4 steps are really quite intertwined, so I'm going to talk about them all at the same time: identifying the goal, technical information, developing the proposed REACH code, and then the stakeholder input and public process. And then I'm going to tease them apart to go a little deeper on each one. But the first thing I want to do is just clarify that this looks very orderly, going from one to the next through this process, but in reality, it's often a little messier. These things feed back to each other, and it can be sort of an iterative process. You're looking at, what's the policy goal, what makes sense, and what's possible legally. You're looking at what are the public concerns, and these all relate to each other and roll up together to create the, they all feed into the proposed REACH code. So you might have one idea, this is what we want to do. Well, actually, this is what's possible. This is what the public is concerned about, what they really want. And this isn't feasible. And how does that relate to the goal and technical information? And then you end up with your proposed REACH code. So they are all, as I said, related, and it's not a linear process in any way, really. So the policy goal, some possible goals could include like climate, lower utility costs, energy reliability, resilience, health. And where does the policy goal come from? Sometimes you'll have direction from your city council or your board. Sometimes you'll have a local sustainability commission or a committee, and could also get it from a climate action plan or a general plan, climate urgency ordinance. It's important because a REACH code is a tool, so part of the process is making sure the tool will help you get to where you want to go. And so to do that, you need to know where you want to go. You need to know the goal that you want the REACH code to help your jurisdiction achieve. Because the goal isn't just to adopt a REACH code, but to adopt a REACH code that will do something for you. So that's one of the early questions is what is it that you're trying to do? What is it that you want the REACH code to do, or whatever tool it is that you're going to use? And then you want to look at what is possible. State law, as we've talked about before, requires REACH codes to be cost effective. So this is a requirement, and next session, a month from today, I think it is, Misty's really going to dive in more on the cost effectiveness. We'll go over a lot more on that. But, in a nutshell, something's cost effective if it saves more money over its life than it costs. So you pay $1,000 for something. If it saves you $100 a month, you've paid for it in 10 months. And if it's going to last more than 10 months, it's cost effective. So that's the overarching, way to look at it. But it's also important to know there are no legal or state requirements regarding how to demonstrate that something's cost effective. Local governments need to make that finding. They need to find that it's cost effective, and they need to have some basis for making that finding. So there's many ways to do that. The easiest way is to use a completed cost effectiveness study, and the utilities REACH code team that Misty coordinates develops some amazing and really good cost effectiveness studies for all climate zones in the state. Remember, there are 16 different climate zones, and what's cost effective in one climate zone might not be cost effective in another, because what's cost effective someplace that it gets really hot in the summer might not be cost effective someplace where it doesn't, or if it gets really cold in the winter as opposed to someplace where it doesn't. So all of those things play into it. So you can use a completed cost effectiveness study for your climate zone. Anyone for your climate zone will work. You can, if you don't see a cost effectiveness study that you want, you can ask for one. You can pay for one on your own, and you can even develop your own. You know, if you certain things, it might be relatively easy to say like, okay, it costs this much based on this. You know, we're going to save this much, so it's cost effective. That's good. You know, that's good enough. So you do have some choices there, and it's good to know that. The other things to be careful of, Misty mentioned federal preemption, where, you know, the Department of Energy establishes some minimum energy standards, and a REACH code can't require the use of appliances that are more efficient than the federal standard. You can make that an option. So if your REACH code requires that you save a certain amount of energy, people could comply with that REACH code by putting in a high efficiency furnace. But you can't require that they put in a high efficiency furnace. There has to be, and you can't require it even indirectly. So there has to be another way for someone to meet that, to make that amount of energy savings. If the only way they can save the amount of energy that you're requiring them to save is by putting in a high efficiency furnace, then you've got a problem with federal preemption. So there always has to be a path that doesn't require the use of more efficient appliances than the federal standard. So that's just a fine point that gets confusing sometimes. And then the other thing to look at in terms of what's possible is what makes sense given the local conditions. So, you know, what's your building stock? What are the anticipated projects? Even looking at your demographics. If you've got a jurisdiction where you're looking at a new construction, single-family home REACH code, but there are only 3 new homes built in your community and all of the new construction is multifamily buildings, then there's a mismatch there. And if you want to achieve your goal, you might want to look at something that relative to multifamily buildings, because, you know, otherwise you're spending a lot of time on something that's not going to get you a lot of bang for your time. So you do want to look at your local conditions as well. All right, and then moving on to the stakeholder part, public concerns and public input. It's helpful to get that public input. It complicates things, but it can also make things better. Can identify where you need more information. People raise questions about something, okay, you need to dig into that and do some research on it. Can help to shape the REACH code. Everyone's concerned about whether their accessory dwelling unit could comply with the REACH code. You do some research. If you find they can't, maybe that's not included in the REACH code. And it can outline what's politically possible. So, you know, common concerns, costs, real world feasibility, like can this be done in the real world? For some types of REACH codes, it's resilience. And really, I think a lot of it boils down to, you know, every person asking, like, how is this going to affect me? How can this affect me? So you need to have the stakeholder engagement in order to hear what people are concerned about, because you can think about what you'd be concerned about, but someone else might have a very different situation. So diving into stakeholder engagement and equity, you want to start early. Think about who are the stakeholders who could be affected, who might come to your public hearings, and think about both individuals and organizations. Sometimes it can be easier to work with organizations, and so you got to think about them as well as people, as well as individual residents. And then you want to think like how best to engage with them. And here I think it's really helpful. You know, some people have a lot of experience with this, some people don't as much, but there is somebody in your city or county who does have experience with this. Either they just did a general plan update or there was just some big public process on something. Usually there's someone. So, you know, take them out to coffee, take them out to lunch, have a chat, have a Zoom call, and just say, so, you know, what do you recommend? I'm just starting this process. What worked for you? And get a sense of how things work in your jurisdiction and with the people that you're trying to connect with. You want to think there's a lot of different stakeholders for reach codes. Some internal, you've got, a city or a county is not just one place, but you've got your elected and appointed officials, you've got sustainability staff, building department staff, public works staff, you've got, planners and so on. And then you've got all the external stakeholders, architects and all the folks listed here. I just want to mention or highlight environmental organizations. I think a lot of times there's a temptation to think, like, I'm doing this green reach code, this reach code to saving energy, reducing greenhouse gases, so all the environmental organizations are going to be behind it. But you want to talk to them early, because sometimes they might want something much more aggressive, and they might come to a meeting and oppose a reach code because they think it doesn't go far enough, or they don't like how the approach. So you want to talk with them early and get them involved with the process so you can hear what the concerns are. Okay, so a couple equity points. This was a presentation Katie Van Dyke did on the City of Berkeley existing buildings electrification strategy, and I stole this from her slide deck because I thought it made a really interesting point. They did meetings with, the blue line here is the public meeting. So it's a standard public meeting where you say, we're going to have a meeting on this, and you notice it, and you maybe put it out on social media and everything, and you say, come to this public meeting down in City Hall. And then the green lines was a Green the Church meeting where they went to a church and had a meeting there with the people there and asked this question: what's your long-term priority? With three choices: housing affordability, energy costs, and climate change impacts. And you can see how the responses they got were quite different depending on which meeting they were at and what people were most concerned about, housing affordability versus climate change impact. So what this really illustrates to me is who you talk with can really affect what you hear. So you need to consider that when you're figuring out who to talk with. And then other kind of equity, looking at the outcomes, distributional equity. It's good to think through, how could different people be affected? Would some people be affected more than others? Can you structure your reach code so that you are not affecting one group more than another, especially historically disadvantaged populations, seniors, people with disabilities, et cetera? So especially if you're working on existing building reach codes, equity is key and challenging. So it's important to consider these and address the equity issues from the start. So that was a lot of stuff. I'm going to pause here for any final questions about anything I've talked about so far, and then I want to move on to our local government panels. You can hear about folks who have done this in the real world and their experiences, and we can have we'll have another question and answer session after that. So, any questions?
Just go ahead and unmute yourself if you have any questions for Karen. There was one in the chat we answered already, Karen.
Okay. Great. All right, I'm just going to give it a second more. All right, and then actually what we'll do, it's 10:43. I really do want to have enough time for this, but let's take a literally 2-minute break and come back at 10:45, and then we'll start with our government panel. Okay? Thanks. All right, that very quick break, but just to give everyone a chance to stretch there. All right, so really excited to hear from local government staff who've been through this process. They volunteered to share their experiences, and excited too that we have a variety of climate zones from Contra Costa County, where they've got climate zones 3 and 12, and 12 gets quite hot in the summer, to Chula Vista, climate zone 7, which is pretty mild year-round, and San Francisco, which is also pretty mild, although in a slightly different way. So there's also a variety of reach codes, but I'm going to let them talk about that. But first, I want to pass it to Angie Hacker of the California Climate and Energy Collaborative, who'll be leading this part of the webinar, moderating the panel discussion, and introducing the speakers. So thanks, Angie.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's so nice to be with you. I just get to play the fun role of being a moderator, and Karen has just done such a nice, and by the way, such a clear and easy to follow job of walking you through the process of a reach code. And now we want to give you an idea of what the process really looks like on the ground within communities where there's lots of different interests and people and options to consider. And so we're really fortunate to be joined today by 3 knowledgeable speakers: Damian Hardman Saldana from Contra Costa County, Corey Downs from the city of Chula Vista, and Barry Hooper from the city and county of San Francisco. They're each going to present for about 5 minutes on their experience developing reach codes before we move into a Q&A. So I just want to remind you, just be really active. Whenever you have a question, drop it in the chat. We're going to get to those at the end after the presentation. So let's go ahead and start with Damian. So Damian is a senior planner with Contra Costa County's Department of Conservation and Development, where he designs and implements energy efficiency programs. He's also instrumental in obtaining funding to develop the county's first climate action plan, and he is the county's representative for Bayren. So go ahead and take it away, Damian. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. And let me get my slides up. Give me a second here. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Perfect. All right. Well, I've been introduced, so I will skip that part, and I only have a few minutes, and I have a lot of content to cover. But we did adopt our first ever reach code. So for us, this is really new. It was a new experience for us, for our jurisdiction. And just some context, our county is just the second jurisdiction in its county to adopt a reach code. The only other jurisdiction is the city of Richmond in western Contra Costa County. So before I get into kind of the details of what our reach code does for new construction, I did want to talk a lot about kind of outreach efforts and public input and kind of how this whole process kind of got started. So back in September 23rd, 2019, was kind of we had a meeting about another issue that the committee then was started talking about building electrification for new construction, and they requested that we come back at a future meeting, which we did in February of 2020. We gave them some initial research, and I got kind of a pulse from our Board of Supervisors Sustainability Committee on kind of what they wanted to see in terms of, and at the time, Berkeley was being, I think, sued for their gas ban, and we were like, okay, well, on the restaurant issue, so they were like, well, we're not sure about restaurants, but see whatever we can cover in terms of what cost effectiveness studies were available at the time. So went back, did all my research, came back in May. In between that, we adopted a climate emergency resolution, which included policy for electrification and for new construction, which helped me and our elected officials moving forward with this actual proposal. So in May was a very technical report to the Sustainability Committee about the process, cost effectiveness, all this the fun stuff Karen just covered in terms of like what's needed to adopt. What was neat was I didn't really have to make the environmental case for this or educate our elected officials on the issue. They seem to be very well versed in terms of the environmental benefits of building electrification and knew that this was one of the tools in their tool belt to address climate change. So it was more about process, more about what's needed from the CEC and what the elected officials felt comfortable doing in terms of their process. Now, who was involved? There was one supervisor in particular that was passionate about wanting to move this forward, and having the recommendation come from the Board of Supervisors Sustainability Committee to the full board was very helpful in terms of this project. It was extremely controversial. There were times at which staff thought that it may not get passed, but it eventually did, and we had an exhaustive outreach process. We were also asked to outreach to the Building Industrial Association, which is a key stakeholder, to get their sense on what they thought, and that's in the slide there. And then the East Bay Leadership Council as well, to get the business interest side in terms of what their issues were on this REACH code. So that was really helpful because they ended up submitting a formal letter at the public hearing, and we were able to address a lot of their issues, which was really helpful. So what ended up being addressed? One key thing is everything listed here is actually what the specific cost effectiveness studies. So we had cost effectiveness studies on all residential buildings, which was really helpful. So that was easy to include that, as well as detached accessory dwelling units. And then the non-residential was interesting because we decided as staff that we would just recommend buildings that were specifically called out in the cost effectiveness studies and not in the non-residential, and that's hotel, office, and retail. We didn't feel comfortable like including restaurants or any other things because the actual cost effectiveness studies only covered hotel, office, and retail, even though a lot of other jurisdictions were using it, that non-residential study for all other types of non-commercial uses as well. And that was just to, I think, feel comfortable about how we were making a determination on cost effectiveness and for our elected officials. Key thing is it allows the use of backup power sources to be fossil fuel operated. That was a big issue. That was a super controversial issue. And then exempts projects with vesting rights, which was a actual legal request from our attorney. That being said, what were the major issues discussed? Grid reliability. Huge learning curve for me to learn about grid reliability. I had to do a lot of research on what the CEC does, the CPUC does, and what SB 100 is about grid reliability, the state's policies on all of those things, and had to rely a lot on the CEC reports on their midterm reliability analysis to make some of our elected officials feel comfortable about adopting this code because of public safety power shutoffs and climate change, other issues. So that was a big thing, and hence the number 2 item there, to allow use of emergency backup power to be fossil fuel, particularly in our rural areas in eastern Contra Costa County. That's it. I know that's a lot of content to cover, but hopefully that's helpful. We are a very diverse county. We have 2 different climate zones. We're not swaying one way versus another way in terms of our political spectrum. It's it's very middle of the ground a lot of the times. So to get something passed by our county like this was quite a feat for us, and it's exciting for us in terms of meeting our environmental goals. And I would say that our environmentalists start talking with them early on. I started talking to them very early in the process to kind of lower expectations. That was a key thing, and that's not shown on the slide, but before we even went to any meetings about this issue, I actually started talking to environmental groups, which were out of our sustainability commission. There were some environmentalists in that commission, and was able to kind of get the word out about what the expectations were, and that was helpful in terms of moving this through the process. But I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien. That was great. I'm excited to hear more during our Q&A. So Stick around for that. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, Corey Downs from the City of Chula Vista. He's a conservation specialist and he leads the climate action planning efforts for the city, including compiling GHG inventory and CAP updates. He also supports the city's residential energy and water efficiency outreach. So go ahead and take it away, Corey. Thanks for being here.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. And you should be seeing, I only have 2 slides today, but I think it's great to hear kind of the work that others are doing, how it kind of feeds into what we decided to do here in Chula Vista, to kind of take a step back and really what led us to the path of looking at existing homes. We adopted a climate action plan in 2017, and we had previously had REACH codes adopted for new construction, looking at percentage below Title 24 compliance. We had looked at electrification a little bit, but we have Climate Zone 7 and actually Climate Zone 10. And one of our climate zones, the electrification wasn't cost effective. And so that made it a little bit more challenging for adoption. And we also had a grant for looking at energy efficiency. And so kind of once you put all those together, we have a significant building stock of existing buildings. And so since we'd had REACH codes for new constructions, it seemed like a natural kind of progression to bring some of that to the existing buildings. That being said, since it wasn't our climate action plan, there definitely were some groups who wanted to engage early on this ordinance. One notably being the realtors. Anything I think with existing building, you'll definitely want to make sure to engage with the realtors. They're often very vocal, very connected with a lot of community members, and so we made a decision pretty early. I believe it was actually in our climate action plan that said, look at existing buildings, in parentheses, not point of sale. So, if that's not necessarily a restriction in your community, that's another approach to go. But with that kind of stakeholder feedback, we really looked at what triggers we had as a local jurisdiction, and our, the existing building significant projects was a big one for us. And so what we adopted was an ordinance that requires homes built before 2006 that are performing additions or major remodels. And that was kind of how our codes worked. I know it works differently in some jurisdictions. To also perform energy efficiency upgrades. And this was really rooted in the energy efficiency, which I think was somewhat of a benefit because, generally energy efficiency, as long as it's cost effective, it's really popular. It's a very, it's not necessarily new technologies. It's, a lot of attic insulation. We had some light bulbs and some other stuff that people were pretty familiar with. I do have, if anyone's interested, there's more details on the website that's listed up there. One thing I just wanted to mention is we have the graphic that we put together, and for existing buildings, where you draw that line. I know some other jurisdictions, it's a dollar amount, and I also think that if your permits are set up that way, that makes a lot of sense. But where you draw that line is really important because a majority of the feedback, or a lot of the pushback that we had against the ordinance, was for items that weren't actually included in the ordinance. So the one I always kind of chuckle about is if you look on there, it says adding or moving a kitchen island does not trigger this requirement. And we added that in there because we got someone who came to City Council and was talking about how it's inappropriate to have this be something if you just want to move your kitchen island. And we said, well, that's not a structural change. That's not actually covered. And they said, well, it doesn't say that anywhere in the ordinance. And so, sometimes it's good to be specific that's not in our ordinance language, but it's in our customer facing materials about the ordinance. So sometimes it's a little bit good to be over specific, especially with with existing buildings. That's something that is a little bit new for a lot of jurisdictions. Our development services staff had a lot of questions about how this will be implemented. Stakeholders had a lot of questions, so the more you can communicate, the better. And then I'll also say our ordinance is currently not being enforced because it is new to our development services staff. They were going through a software change as well as COVID on top of that, and going to in-person, remote It's been a little challenging to implement a new ordinance on top of those, but we are getting closer to there. And so, one thing I think is always great is just make sure to connect with development services, and they're your internal kind of they're your partner on the implementation of these ordinances. So the more resources and feedback that you can take from them in the development process, the better. And we'll be reviewing some of the exemptions that are in here because they were a little bit different than what development services traditionally reviews. But again, a lot of those were put in place to ensure stakeholders that it wouldn't be an onerous process. We have like a low income exemption. There's a technical infeasibility exemption. And so, there's a lot of concern that this requirement would impact people that maybe, wouldn't be able to comply with it. And so we wanted to make sure there there's exemptions, but conservation staff is going to be reviewing those, not development staff. One other thing that I'd like to mention is a new tool that has been promoted or been adopted or presented since our ordinance has been adopted, and that's the Explore Cost Effectiveness tool. So our ordinance as adopted is pretty prescriptive. An LED light bulb measure is the same as a heat pump water heater measure. We know that's not the same impact, but we just didn't have the technical ability to kind of model all of those. But the local code Cost Effectiveness Explorer does all of that for your climate zones. And so now what we're moving towards is a more flexible approach that provides more impact or more credit for the deeper energy saving measures. And so you can kind of see here in each different building vintage, they'll need to reach up to a target score, and that score can be changed on the website too. So we were able to kind of scale it down to where it aligns with what we presented to City Council. And we also have some language about changing the measures. And for existing buildings, I think this is really important because technology is definitely going to change throughout your implementation. And at least for us, it was a challenge going through City Council. We presented to two committees or commissions in preparation to City Council. And then we went to City Council 3 times, presented twice. One item just got pushed. But the other time we presented, they had some feedback. They wanted to see more flexibility. And so we started going down this route. And this is kind of keeping with that path. Yeah, so, we're still, like I said, working with our development services to implement this ordinance and promote it in general. But I think for us, some of the keys were, sticking to energy efficiency and having it be something that is cost effective for the homeowners while allowing flexibility to bring in some of the very popular non-cost effective improvements like heat pump water heater. And then also, I think we struggled to incorporate equity. I think we would have liked to have a little bit more support for homeowners going through these processes. But one thing that I do think is important is that these measures do increase the energy efficiency of existing building stock, which is typically has the more low-income residents in our city. And so, increasing the energy efficiency saves them on their utility bills, but there's also some really important adaptation measures like attic insulation. That's definitely something that helps with extreme heat. It's a passive measure. And so there's lots of different ways that these are improving the existing building stock to help all residents of Chula Vista, not just the ones that can afford new homes. And so I think that there was some popularity and some really encouragement for the core of these measures. There was just a lot of concern about the impact that they would have, and that's something that we'll still have to see. And that's all for me.
Thank you, Corey. All right, excited to have you in our Q&A as well. And finally, last but not least, we have our final panelist, Barry Hooper. He's a senior green building coordinator with San Francisco Department of Environment. He's responsible for San Francisco's existing building energy performance ordinance, which is the first energy benchmarking and audit ordinance for local buildings in California. He also collaborates with San Francisco's Department of Building Inspection to develop and implement local green building requirements. So thank you so much for being here, Barry. Go ahead and take it away.
You betcha. Thank you. Thank you very much, Angie. I just going to briefly outline I'm gonna have a classic webinar challenge. There we go. In San Francisco, we've had reach codes since 2008 and have both renewed or amended those reach codes regularly since then. And pleased to introduce you to my dog, Oliver. And so that yields quite a range of different approaches that apply to both to new buildings and to existing buildings. The longest standing requirements relate to green building rating systems, looking at the building as a whole. And those systems have included, energy efficiency requirements within them as well. As it stands today, San Francisco for new construction requires new buildings of 10 floors or less to install PV, solar thermal or a living roof, to be wired for extending electric vehicles to any and all parking spaces that are constructed, off-street parking spaces constructed as a result of the construction project. The city does require all electric new construction. In the limited situations where one might get an exception and be allowed to build a mixed fuel building, there also are energy efficiency requirements that apply, and essentially that boils down to a 10% compliance margin for a mixed fuel building. And then there also are non-energy requirements that do have some implications for building energy use, such as if you're building more than 100,000 square feet of new construction, which is not uncommon for us, you're obliged to provide on-site non-potable water treatment facilities. And so I bring up this range of approaches to highlight that some of these are what I'd call what I believe is the most common use of the term a reach code. They are standards that affect energy consumption in the building directly and have been reviewed by the California Energy Commission to affirm that we've completed an appropriate process and demonstrated that they're cost effective. Some of these requirements are affect the building's systems that do ultimately use energy, but they're not building energy standards. So one I'll highlight is all electric new construction. This is a building code requirement. Essentially, you can't get a building permit in San Francisco for any project proposing to put in natural gas piping. And you also are not allowed to add a natural gas piping after the fact to an existing building that's all electric. So it's sort of the inverse local stakeholder concern that Demian outlined, but that's also a building code rather than a reach code. And similarly, the non-potable water treatment requirements, those do impose a energy consumption implication, but they're housed in the health and utility codes. We also have a number of requirements aiming to advance energy performance in existing buildings, as Angie mentioned, energy benchmarking and disclosure, as well as energy audits, retrocommissioning, or a plan for decarbonization called a strategic decarbonization assessment. Those are required for commercial buildings of 10,000 square feet and larger citywide. The largest commercial buildings are required starting in late 2022 to transition to subscribing to a grid supplied 100% renewable electricity product, such as PG&E's Solar Choice, our CCA's Clean Power SF's Super Green product, or also the city is home to a municipal utility, the Hetch Hetchy Power, any of those products. And then we also do have existing time of sale requirements that relate to both the energy improvements for buildings built before the energy code. And I think much more recently, by which I mean about 10 years old, water efficiency upgrade requirements at time of sale and I would just put those together because both they're implemented concurrently via the same process. And the water upgrade requirements are match the current opportunities in code, and they're, I think, working well as a public policy, whereas our residential time of sale energy conservation ordinance is definitely targeted for an upgrade. It's an older policy that it's time to renew and modify it. So just want to highlight that some of our work directly entails specific energy requirements, and some has implications for energy use and carbon emission, but is not a modification of the energy or green building code. And so our process for adopting a REACH code would be ultimately similar to what Karen outlined, that there is, the public policy impetus, there's extensive stakeholder input. If it's a major change, typically we form a task force of affected stakeholders to talk it through in a working setting. Then we need public agency buy-in, workshops, and then a litany of public meetings. And so that boils down to an absolute minimum of 7 notice public meetings, as well as quite a number of the public policy making meetings seeking broader input in advance of those meetings. Then the CEC application, if it's going to directly influence energy use, and of course, Building Standards Commission. Kind of maybe a little bit interestingly, when we're renewing a REACH code, so to maintain energy standards from one code cycle to another, we're looking at those requirements at least a year in advance. We still hold public workshop, at least one public workshop, just to maintain requirements. There are a number of public meetings. Typically, it actually adds up to a slightly larger number of public meetings because it fits in the context of the overall adoption and modifications of the state building code. And then, a challenge process-wise is that our public process is quite extensive. And when we get to the end of that line, that's when we are able to apply to the California Energy Commission for their approval as well. And a challenge that I just want to flag, if you are working against the timeline, is if you complete your public policy process, keep in mind that the CEC will typically only consider an application for approval of local REACH code after you've been through your second reading, and then they post it for public comment, which is required by state law, but is always a little ironic given that the stakeholders most affected would be the ones who would have already commented. And so that adds up to a bare minimum of 15-day, but more commonly on the order of 60-day process. And I really appreciate the urgency and priority the Commission's put to it in recent years, but it's still a significant amount of time you have to bake into your expectations. So what's transferable out of all that to elsewhere? I think there's a couple really key points. And one is that it's just helpful to differentiate between local public policy making priorities and absolute requirements of state law. And so one is that San Francisco has maintained REACH codes in every code cycle since 2008, based on the published cost effectiveness studies. Those REACH codes have applied to all uses of new construction, or where there's been an exception, it's been an explicit exception based on local priority. So for a period, for example, laboratory buildings were in the past were excluded from some of San Francisco's requirements. And so we have, by contrast, REACH code studies look at the types of uses that are both recognized to be common statewide, because there's an investment of money in developing the study and we make sure that it's is impactful. But it's finite, the number of uses that get studied. And so as a result, we have duly adopted and implemented regulations based on findings of cost effectiveness for a number of representative building types rather than an exhaustive list exactly matching the full list of building types. And I just bring that up because every scale of new construction does occur here in quantity. That's just a balance to be struck between what's necessary to meet the standards enforced by the Energy Commission. Essentially what they're looking for is a public process and a finding, an informed finding in a public setting of cost effectiveness, whereas your local officials may really want a little bit more than that, as some of us have been alluding to. And that just is a function of your local politics. So with that, I'll pause for the Q&A and do my best to smoothly stop sharing my screen without sharing all my emails.
Thank you, Barry, and thanks to all three of you. So interesting. It's really nice to see folks from different parts of the state approaching this differently. If you're just getting started, you are probably getting an inkling of how many options you have, how many tools you have at your disposal to do things that really fit your community. So I'm going to start ticking off some of the questions that came through the chat. I want to encourage folks to continue to do that. Put your questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, that's welcome too. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So the first one here, has anyone ever successfully challenged a jurisdiction's cost-effectiveness methodologies? I found the observation that the study did not include restaurants was interesting to note. And I know that Misty actually put something in the chat here to answer that. Misty, do you want to share any more information here? And then any of the panelists can feel free to chime in as well.
Hi, yes. We will be releasing a study on restaurants. We just finished that up. We'll be releasing that this week. We did not include them originally. They became a big point of interest after we actually started the study. And so they weren't included in the original scope. But we did go back and do the study on restaurants. We have found some opportunities. There are still some serious challenges in restaurants, but there are some opportunities there as well. And we'll be releasing that later this week.
Just to real specifically answer that question, though, no. So a very small fraction of REACH codes have ever been subject to legal challenge at all. And where they've been subject to legal challenge, it's been more common that it's either a fairness issue, so a concern of the stakeholder class, or a federal appliance standards preemption concern. And that's actually the example of where the stakeholders won was in New Mexico, probably 15 years ago, where the REACH code implicitly required more efficient appliances than the federal standards.
Thank you for adding that, Barry.
Okay, great. Well, this is a question for Damien. Can you share the information that that was discovered on grid reliability?
Yeah, I can. I can definitely. What we should do is send my staff report for this group to take a look at. I think hopefully all my homework on that could be used across the state in terms of what the CEC's been doing, what SB 100 has to say. So SB 100 is kind of the policy from the state that says they need to decarbonize the electric grid, basically make the grid all electric and get away from fossil fuels. And then there's what the CEC process is and the CPUC process is in terms of procuring power, and the CEC's rules in terms of reliability and all their process as well. And they all have their different reports too. So it is a complicated thing, and a lot of it is outlined in my staff report, and I can definitely send that out to Karen so it can be distributed to the rest of this group, because I think it's super important information that can help frame the discussion related to grid reliability. What was helpful for us is our new construction. They wanted to know how much residential new construction was happening per year. It's about 200 units per year. And that's not a substantial amount. I mean, for some jurisdictions, that's a lot. I know in Marin County, that's a lot more construction than Marin County has in the Bay Area. But that context is helpful in terms of the policymakers making a decision in terms of its overall impact to new construction.
Perfect. This makes me think, Misty or Karen, do you want to chime in here about where folks can go to find templates and staff reports and things like that? Because I know that's a lot of what you all are compiling.
Sure. Depending on exactly what you're looking for, some of the easiest places to go. If you want to find staff reports from other jurisdictions, localenergycodes.com. I think it used to be, at least if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see where all of they've got a map, and you can also have a table view. The CEC also has a website where you can go to the docket, and then you can get all of the documents that have been filed with them. So through either of those channels, you should be able to get like the staff report, the ordinance, and you know, and everything's online if you Google it eventually. So, but those are the two easiest places to start. And then we do have, there are templates both on BayREN's website and I think localenergycodes.com. So those are good places to look. And in the resources slides, like I put links to the CEC and the Building Standards Commission's websites, their documents as to what, you know, what to submit for them and what exactly they're looking for. So I think that's everything. Everything I can think of right now. Misty, what I forget?
The Building Decarbonization Coalition also posts a lot of resources. They have model language as well as the electric kitchen resources and several others as well. Also a great resource.
Yeah, and it's the Clean Building Compass. If you go there, and then they've got a search function and you can find all kinds of stuff.
Well, you know, I think and these resources are going to continue to be brought up in the course of this webinar series because they're so important. And actually I have a good follow-up question for the panel on that. What would you recommend? Did you find any resources out there that were really helpful in sort of shortcutting the process for you, or anything that was available externally that was supportive as you got started that you could recommend to others?
I'll take a quick first shot. You know, I'd say it's been mentioned before, but the cost effectiveness studies are definitely a really great resource. You know, that was exactly why the reason we were able to show city leaders that, you know, there's these resources that we can take advantage of and they'll minimize staff resource and kind of do a lot of the heavy technical lifting. And so those are really helpful. And then the other one, I mentioned it in my presentation, but the local tool explorer, cost effectiveness tool explorer, you know, unless you really like digging through PDFs, that tool makes it a lot easier. You can just zoom to your climate zones. You get like summaries of the impacts. And so, you know, I think it's still good to dive into the full report so you get more of the details. But like for presenting to city leaders, that tool is really good and was definitely instrumental in our code adoption.
And I would second that. That was huge for me in terms of presenting material to our elected officials as well.
I like PDFs. I mean, I'm so glad that the simplifying resources are available, but so a challenge that we've had is if you have requirement X on the books and now you have an additional requirement that's going to meld with it, you know, is that the exact scenario that the cost effectiveness studies studied? And so in that context, it was handy to be able to do a little math on the side as well. And so I appreciate both ways the data is presented.
Oh, she's on mute.
You're on mute, Angie.
One last thing on the studies, just to let folks know, if you are like Barry and you like to do some of those side calcs and get into the real meat of the numbers, and you do need information on the source data or something like that, please do contact us. And if we have the data, we are happy to help you with that.
So I see some questions coming in that are more general about process that Misty is sort of trying to answer here, and I know that's going to be answered throughout the course of this series. I'm going to make use of having the experts we have on hand to talk a little bit more about their experience. And you know, now that you've worked out your REACH code, you are facing implementation. What do you know now that you wish you had known when you were starting, and what words of advice would you give to our listeners?
I'll go first. You know, I always think it's good to be ambitious. You know, when we were first talking about this REACH code for existing buildings, there was like a lot of people who said, well, you know, that's not what we do. We don't look at existing buildings like that. And so, you know, I think it's good if you haven't done something, if your jurisdiction hasn't adopted a REACH code in the past, it's a great time to do to do that. You know, it's always good to temper that with, you know, the support that you have from your city staff and stakeholders. But, you know, there's a lot of resources that are available, and I think a lot of great examples now from other jurisdictions. And so there's definitely some good opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was kind of thrown for a loop on the grid reliability. It kind of came out of nowhere in the middle of the public meeting. Um, and we were lucky to have multiple discussion items. I think that's probably maybe was the reason we did. So just being a little bit more prepared about the overall what the state's policy stuff was. I had to do a ton of homework kind of in between meetings on those issues. So hopefully what I went through, others can be more prepared for. But yeah, that was a really interesting curveball for me. And then the pool and spa industry was an interesting one. They kind of came out of the woodwork at the very end, kind of saying, we don't want this. We want an exemption for all our pools, and had to do a lot of research at the end there. And I would just lean on all your I probably could have leaned on more help from Misty. Misty was great in helping me kind of respond to a lot of those things, but I probably could have leaned on her more. And Barry is also a great resource. If you can get a phone call to Barry, that's what I did. And on some of these technical issues that come up at the meetings, and it's okay not to know the answers to all of them, because it is super technical. This stuff can get when they start talking about different issues. So yeah, I don't know, but it was interesting. You think you got it all covered, you never do. And do the best you can, I guess. But it was an interesting experience. What have I learned? It's kind of think for me, I get into the weeds a little bit too much. So know where your weaknesses and strengths are as staff is always a good one to learn. And so pulling back and looking at SB 100 and those big picture state policy things were really helpful.
So Barry, we're gonna have to turn it over, but any quick words of wisdom?
There's a way to get it done.
Just a pep talk.
It's valuable to be as similar as possible to your nearby jurisdictions, but at the same time, if there's a clear public policy priority, it can be done.
All right. Well, panelists, could you give me a thumbs up if you're willing to have anybody come and ask you questions, call you, or email you? All right. Thank
Definitely.
you. That was really helpful. I really appreciate you guys' time. And with that, thank you all for your good questions. I'm going to hand it back over to Misty.
Alrighty. Thank you very much. And thank you also from me, panelists. That was really wonderful to hear your experiences and the variety of challenges that you faced and overcame also. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to remind everybody that we have 3 more webinars